He's just a poor nobody.
They wanted us looking at the wrong man. Then who were they protecting?
Alan Barnes was 41 years old and worked as an operations compliance manager for Midwest Freight Solutions in Indianapolis, Indiana. To everyone around him, he looked like another quiet, middle-class professional who had settled for an ordinary life. His neighbors believed his ambitious wife, Piper Barnes, deserved someone far more successful. Alan still drove an 11-year-old Chevrolet Silverado repaired worn leather shoes instead of buying new ones, and carried homemade lunches to work every morning. What nobody knew was that years earlier, he had quietly protected billions of dollars without ever accepting recognition. Then Piper laughed, raised her glass inside a glittering Chicago ballroom, and called him a poor nobody in front of her wealthy friends. At that exact moment, Billionaire host Richard Whitmore stopped walking, stared across the room, and rushed straight toward Alan. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, tell me your country and your local time. In the comments, I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you love powerful stories about quiet strength, hidden truths, and unforgettable justice, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Alan Barnes had never believed that silence made a man weak. Every weekday began at exactly 5:30 a.m. His alarm chimed once before he reached over and turned it off. He never hit snooze. Within 15 minutes, the coffee maker filled the kitchen with the rich smell of dark roast, while oatmeal simmered on the stove. The house remained quiet. Piper rarely woke before 7, especially after evenings spent attending networking dinners or private wine tastings with clients. Alan preferred those peaceful mornings. He ironed his own shirts, polished the same brown leather shoes he had owned for nearly 7 years, and checked traffic reports before leaving their brick colonial home on the north side of Indianapolis. His 11-year-old Chevrolet Silverado started with the familiar low rumble that reminded him of reliability instead of age. Most people saw an old truck. Alan saw something that had never failed him. He arrived at Midwest Freight Solutions every morning before 7:30. The warehouse was already alive by then. Forklifts beeped between loading docks. Drivers compared delivery routes, while dispatchers studied weather updates from Ohio, Illinois, and Michigan. Alan greeted everyone the same way. "Morning, Mike." "Good morning, Denise. How's your daughter's soccer season going?" He remembered birthdays. He remembered children's names. He remembered which employee's mother had recently undergone surgery. That mattered more to him than whether anyone remembered his job title. His office reflected the same philosophy. No expensive artwork, no oversized desk, no framed awards. Only organized shelves filled with federal transportation regulations, compliance manuals, audit reports, and a small framed photograph of his late father standing beside an aging pickup truck somewhere outside Terre Haute, nearly 30 years earlier. His father had once told him something Alan never forgot. The loudest people usually spend their lives proving something. The quiet ones already know who they are. Alan carried those words everywhere. Piper carried something else. She carried expectations. When they first met, 11 years earlier, at Butler University during an alumni fundraising event, Piper admired Alan's confidence. Not loud confidence, calm confidence. She liked that he listened before speaking. She told her friends he made her feel safe. Somewhere over the years, safety stopped impressing her. Success became measured differently. Luxury hotels, exclusive clubs, designer handbags, private wine collections, photographs taken beside people whose names appeared in Forbes magazine. Piper worked as Senior Client Relations Director for Sterling and Pierce Luxury Consulting, a Chicago-based firm specializing in branding affluent businesses and high-end real estate developments. Her career introduced her to executives, investors, celebrities, and entrepreneurs whose conversations revolved around acquisitions, investment portfolios, and vacation homes. Gradually, she began comparing Alan to those men. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It happened one small comment at a time. You still drive that truck? You could at least buy a nicer watch. My coworkers think you're shy. You'd look more successful in tailored suits. Alan usually smiled. Sometimes he nodded. Occasionally, he simply changed the subject. He never argued. Not because he agreed, because experience had taught him something valuable. Arguments rarely changed people who were determined not to listen. On Friday evenings, Piper often invited friends to expensive restaurants. Olivia Carter never arrived without mentioning her husband's newest investment. Brianna Mitchell loved discussing vacation properties in Aspen and Napa Valley. Courtney Hayes somehow managed to turn every conversation into one about exclusive memberships. Alan usually ordered grilled salmon. The women usually ordered conversations. One evening, Olivia looked toward Alan with polite curiosity. So, Alan, remind me again. What exactly do you manage? Before Alan could answer, Piper laughed. He manages paperwork. Everyone chuckled. Alan simply took another sip of iced tea. Another evening, Courtney admired Brianna's new Range Rover before glancing through the restaurant window. Alan, are you seriously still driving that old Silverado? Piper answered again. He refuses to let it die. More laughter. Alan smiled politely. No irritation reached his face. Only quiet observation. The narrator understood something no one else inside the restaurant recognized. Alan noticed everything. He noticed who interrupted waiters, who spoke kindly to parking attendants, who thanked receptionists, who only respected people wearing expensive suits. Those details always mattered more to him than conversations about money, because character usually revealed itself during ordinary moments. Piper no longer noticed ordinary moments. She had become increasingly occupied by extraordinary appearances. Her social media pages displayed rooftop parties overlooking downtown Chicago luxury resorts in Scottsdale Charity, auctions, gala dinners, and networking events filled with smiling executives holding crystal glasses beneath glittering chandeliers. Alan appeared in very few photographs, not because he refused, because Piper gradually stopped asking him. Several weeks before the Whitmore Foundation charity gala, Piper returned home carrying a thick cream-colored envelope embossed with elegant gold lettering. She placed it carefully on the kitchen counter. Alan looked up from reviewing shipping compliance reports on his laptop. Special invitation? She smiled. The Whitmore Foundation. Alan paused. He recognized the name immediately. Richard Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Global Holdings, one of the country's most respected manufacturing entrepreneurs, a businessman known almost as much for ethical leadership as financial success. Piper sounded excited. This isn't like the usual charity dinners. Alan closed his laptop. No. She shook her head. Only around 400 guests, CEOs, investors, political leaders, foundation directors. It's invitation only. Alan nodded. Sounds important. It is. She hesitated. Married guests are expected to attend together. Alan looked toward her. You want me there? I need you there. There was a difference. Alan heard it immediately. Piper continued arranging the invitation on the counter. My clients will be there. So will Olivia Brianna Courtney. She paused before adding quietly, I don't want people asking why my husband stayed home. Alan looked at her for several seconds. His expression remained gentle. I'll come. Relief crossed Piper's face almost instantly. Thank you. Neither mentioned the real reason. Alan understood appearances mattered more to Piper than companionship. Piper assumed Alan didn't notice. He noticed. He simply chose not to fight every disappointment. The following week passed quietly. Alan finished reviewing 3 internal compliance audits involving interstate freight documentation. He recommended additional employee training instead of disciplinary action. His supervisor thanked him for avoiding unnecessary conflict. Alan replied with the same sentence he often used. Most problems are easier to prevent than punish. On Thursday afternoon, he left work carrying a worn leather briefcase. His coworker Mike called after him. "Big weekend." Alan smiled. "My wife has a charity gala." Mike laughed. "Need a tuxedo?" "I already have one." "Old, about 10 years," Mike grinned. "Still fits." Alan looked down. "Barely." Both men laughed. That evening, Alan removed the tuxedo from the closet. The fabric remained in excellent condition. He brushed away invisible dust before hanging it carefully beside the bedroom window. Piper walked into the room carrying 2 expensive garment bags. One contained a custom black evening gown. The other held designer shoes. She glanced toward Alan's tuxedo. "You're really wearing that one?" Alan nodded. "It still works." She hesitated. "I suppose." He noticed the disappointment in her eyes. He said nothing. Saturday arrived warm and clear. The drive from Indianapolis to Chicago took nearly 3 hours. During most of the trip, Piper answered work emails. Alan kept both hands on the steering wheel. Classical music played softly through the speakers. Traffic thickened as the Chicago skyline appeared beyond Lake Michigan. Eventually, the towering Whitmore Grand Hotel came into view. Luxury vehicles filled the entrance. Valets hurried between Bentleys, Mercedes, Ferraris, and black executive SUVs. Alan parked where instructed. As they stepped onto the marble entrance plaza, he immediately noticed something unusual. Security. Far more security than most charity events required. Discreet earpieces. Private protection teams. Uniformed Chicago police officers stationed near each entrance. Several familiar faces from national business magazines walked toward the ballroom surrounded by assistants. Alan quietly observed everything. Nothing seemed accidental. Inside the magnificent lobby, crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors, while a string quartet performed near the grand staircase. Piper adjusted her necklace one final time before looking toward Alan. "Just try not to disappear tonight." Alan smiled faintly. "I'll be exactly where you leave me." Piper didn't hear the sadness hidden inside those words. She had already spotted Olivia waving excitedly across the ballroom. Alan followed a few steps behind. As conversations echoed beneath glittering ceilings and champagne glasses caught the light, he felt an unexpected sensation. Someone was watching him. He slowly lifted his eyes toward the opposite side of the ballroom. Standing near the stage, surrounded by board members and distinguished guests, Richard Whitmore had suddenly stopped in mid-conversation. The billionaire was staring directly at Alan. Richard Whitmore stood nearly 60 feet away, surrounded by board members, donors, and executives whose combined companies employed hundreds of thousands of people across America. Yet his attention remained fixed on only one face: Alan Barnes. The orchestra continued playing. Champagne glasses continued clinking. Servers crossed the ballroom carrying silver trays topped with lobster medallions and miniature filet mignon. Nobody noticed the billionaire had stopped listening to the conversation around him. Nobody except Alan. For only a second their eyes met. Alan's expression remained unchanged. Calm, respectful, almost curious. Then Piper gently caught his arm. "There they are." She nodded toward 3 women standing near an enormous floral arrangement beneath one of the crystal chandeliers. Olivia Carter wore an emerald green designer gown that probably cost more than Alan's truck. Brianna Mitchell sparkled beneath layers of diamonds that reflected every light inside the ballroom. Courtney Hayes lifted a champagne flute while laughing loudly enough to attract attention from nearby guests. "Piper!" The 3 women embraced one another with practiced enthusiasm. Air kisses, compliments, questions about vacations. Alan stood quietly beside his wife, while introductions quickly shifted into conversations about luxury homes, exclusive golf clubs, and private investment dinners. Olivia smiled politely toward Alan. "Good to see you again." "You too." She tilted her head. "Still working for... what was it?" Midwest Freight Solutions, Alan answered. Oh, yes. She nodded as though trying to remember something insignificant. The shipping company. Alan smiled. That's right. Courtney joined the conversation. So what exactly do you do there? Alan opened his mouth. Before a single word left him, Piper laughed. He keeps freight companies out of trouble. The women chuckled. Piper continued. Basically paperwork. More laughter. Alan didn't correct her. His work involved far more than paperwork: compliance investigations, federal transportation regulations, risk assessments, internal corporate audits, whistleblower protection procedures. But explanations only mattered to people genuinely interested. These women weren't. Olivia took another sip of champagne. So you're not one of the executives? Alan shook his head. No. Courtney smiled sympathetically. Well, somebody has to keep everything organized. Again, the women laughed. Alan simply nodded. The narrator noticed what nobody else did. Alan wasn't embarrassed. He was studying them. Years of compliance work had taught him to observe before reacting. People always revealed themselves if given enough time. Piper suddenly noticed a diamond necklace worn by Brianna. Oh my goodness. She leaned closer. Is that new? My husband surprised me. Brianna beamed proudly. From Harry Winston. Courtney whistled. What did that cost? Brianna shrugged casually. I never asked. The women laughed again. Piper instinctively glanced toward Alan, not with affection, with comparison. The look lasted less than 2 seconds, but Alan saw it. He always did. Olivia looked toward Alan once more. So, Alan, she smiled politely. What kind of car do you drive these days? Alan answered honestly. A Silverado. Courtney raised an eyebrow. The same one? Yes. Olivia blinked. Seriously? Piper laughed before Alan could continue. It's practically family at this point. Everyone laughed again. Courtney shook her head. I don't know how you do it. Piper answered. He says it still runs. Another round of laughter. Alan smiled faintly. It does. Courtney grinned. I suppose replacing it isn't exactly a priority. Piper lifted her champagne glass. Let's just say Alan has never been accused of spending too much money. Olivia smirked. That's one way to save. Alan remained silent. He had learned something long ago. Defending yourself against mockery usually convinced mockers they had landed a successful blow. Silence denied them that satisfaction. Across the ballroom, Richard Whitmore continued watching. One of his vice presidents quietly asked, Richard. No response. Richard's eyes never left Alan. Back near the women, conversation drifted toward vacation homes. Olivia had recently purchased property in Naples, Florida. Courtney discussed skiing in Vail. Brianna mentioned chartering a yacht near Newport. Piper contributed photographs from a recent luxury resort in Scottsdale. Then Olivia turned toward Alan. What about you? We usually spend weekends at Brown County State Park. Alan answered honestly. I enjoy hiking. 3 women exchanged quick glances. Courtney forced a smile. Very outdoorsy. Piper laughed louder this time. Alan thinks camping is a luxury vacation. Several nearby guests overheard. A few smiled politely. Others simply looked away. Alan remained composed. He noticed a waiter accidentally drop a serving fork. Before anyone reacted, Alan bent down, picked it up carefully by the handle, and handed it back. No worries. The young waiter looked relieved. Thank you, sir. Alan nodded once, then returned to standing quietly beside Piper. Richard Whitmore saw that too, every detail. The billionaire had spent 40 years building companies. He trusted numbers, he trusted evidence, but he trusted one thing even more: how powerful people treated those who couldn't help them. Alan had just treated a nervous waiter with more respect than many executives treated their own employees. Richard's memory stirred. 8 years, 8 long years. A quiet voice, measured words, absolute professionalism. The face looked older now, a little more weathered, but unmistakable. Back among Piper's friends, Olivia noticed the ballroom's display of rare, silent auction items. An antique Rolex, signed championship memorabilia, a vintage Shelby Cobra scheduled for charity bidding. She laughed softly. Alan? What? If Piper lets you bid tonight, what would you buy? Alan looked toward the display. A children's literacy program. The women blinked. Courtney laughed uncertainly. No, seriously. I am serious. Brianna smiled awkwardly. I meant the auction items. Alan nodded. I know. Silence lingered. Piper quickly rescued the conversation. My husband isn't exactly fascinated by luxury. Courtney grinned. We've noticed. The group laughed again. Piper looked directly at Alan. Then she said the sentence that would divide her life into before and after. Ladies, she raised her champagne flute with theatrical amusement. This is why I always tell people not to judge appearances. The women smiled. Piper continued. I may wear designer dresses. She gently touched Alan's tuxedo sleeve. But at home I'm married to a poor nobody. The words echoed farther than she intended. Several conversations nearby slowed. One businessman lowered his wine glass. A violinist briefly glanced toward the group. Alan felt dozens of eyes turn toward him. Heat spread through Piper's cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from enjoying the attention her joke received. Olivia burst into laughter first. Courtney followed. Brianna covered her mouth while laughing. A few strangers smiled politely, simply because everyone else seemed amused. Alan looked at Piper. Not angrily, not even sadly, only quietly. There had been many moments over the years. Small insults, dismissive comments, public jokes. This one felt different. Not because it hurt more, because something inside him became completely still. He realized there was nothing left to repair. The marriage he had been trying to preserve through patience had quietly ended before either of them admitted it. He lowered his eyes toward the untouched champagne in his hand, then calmly placed the glass onto a passing server's tray. No dramatic reaction, no argument, no humiliation returned, just quiet dignity. Across the ballroom, Richard Whitmore finally moved. One board member asked, "Richard, where are you going?" "What?" The billionaire never answered. He stepped away from governors, CEOs, senators, and international investors without another word. His pace was steady, purposeful. Every few seconds, another guest noticed where he was walking. Conversations gradually faded. Heads turned. People instinctively created space. Piper noticed first. Her smile widened. "Oh my God," Olivia whispered excitedly. "Richard Whitmore is coming over." Courtney quickly adjusted her necklace. Brianna straightened her posture. Piper discreetly checked her makeup in the reflection of a champagne bucket. She assumed what everyone else assumed. The billionaire host had recognized one of Sterling and Pierce's top client directors. Perhaps he wanted to thank her for supporting the foundation. Perhaps he intended to introduce her to important donors. She never imagined another possibility. Alan watched Richard approach without moving. The distance between them shortened. 30 feet, 20, 15. The ballroom had become strangely quiet. Richard Whitmore stopped directly in front of the group. Everyone waited for him to greet Piper. Instead, the billionaire looked past every smiling face until his eyes met Alan's once again. His expression softened into unmistakable recognition. Then he slowly said 2 words. Alan Barnes. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The entire ballroom seemed to pause with Richard Whitmore's words hanging in the air. Alan Barnes. Richard's voice carried neither surprise nor uncertainty. It carried recognition. Alan offered a respectful nod. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." The billionaire's face broke into a genuine smile, one that seemed completely out of place among the stunned expressions surrounding them. "My goodness," Richard said warmly. "It really is you." Alan smiled politely. "It's been a long time." "Far too long." Richard stepped forward without hesitation. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, he wrapped both arms around Alan in a firm embrace. Gasps rippled across the ballroom. Several champagne glasses froze halfway to waiting lips. A television reporter covering the charity event instinctively turned toward the unexpected scene. Piper's smile disappeared. Olivia blinked twice. Courtney's jaw literally dropped. Brianna whispered, "What is happening?" Richard stepped back, but kept both hands on Alan's shoulders. "I've looked for you for years." Alan chuckled softly. "I've been fairly easy to find." Richard laughed. "No, you've been deliberately impossible." Around them, conversations had completely stopped. Nearly every guest in the ballroom was watching. Some recognized Richard Whitmore as one of the most influential businessmen in America. Very few had ever seen him interrupt a gala to greet someone personally. Almost nobody had ever seen him embrace a guest. Richard turned toward the others. "I hope you'll forgive me." His eyes remained on Alan. "I've interrupted your conversation." Piper recovered enough to extend her hand. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Piper Barnes, Alan's wife." Richard shook her hand courteously. "A pleasure." Nothing more. No extended greeting, no compliment, no special attention. He immediately looked back at Alan. "I've wanted to thank you properly for 8 years." A confused silence followed. Piper frowned. "Thank him." Richard nodded. "Yes." Alan answered before Richard could continue. "There really isn't any need." Richard smiled. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." The billionaire glanced toward several members of his executive team, who had followed him across the ballroom. One of them whispered quietly, "Sir, the foundation presentation begins in 12 minutes." Richard waved dismissively. "It can wait." The executive looked surprised, but nodded. Alan spoke gently. "You shouldn't keep your guests waiting." Richard laughed. "Tonight's guests can wait another few minutes." The statement carried enough authority that nobody questioned it. Piper looked from Richard to Alan and back again. "I'm sorry," she hesitated. "Have you two met before?" Richard looked genuinely surprised. "You don't know?" Piper forced a nervous smile. "I don't think so." Richard looked toward Alan. "You never told her," Alan answered calmly. "It never seemed important." Piper stared at her husband. "What never seemed important?" Richard folded his arms. "Typical Alan." He shook his head with amused disbelief. "You save a man's company from catastrophe, and never mention it." Several people standing nearby exchanged puzzled glances. Olivia quietly whispered, "Did he say, save his company so?" Courtney nodded almost imperceptibly. Richard continued. "Actually," he smiled, "you saved far more than my company." Alan lowered his eyes slightly. "You handled the outcome." "No." Richard's expression became serious. "You created the outcome." The confusion surrounding the group only deepened. Piper felt her heartbeat quicken. She suddenly realized she knew almost nothing about her husband's professional history before joining Midwest Freight Solutions. She knew he had worked in logistics. She knew he traveled occasionally. She knew he disliked discussing work. Beyond that, very little. Richard gestured toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. "Would you mind walking with me?" Alan nodded. "Of course." Richard turned politely toward Piper. "If you'll excuse us for just a moment." Before Piper could respond, the billionaire and Alan began walking side by side toward a private seating area overlooking the ballroom. Two security officers discreetly followed several steps behind. The crowd instinctively parted to let them pass. Every eye followed. Olivia slowly turned toward Piper. "Piper," her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Exactly who is your husband?" Piper opened her mouth. No answer came, because she honestly didn't know. Across the ballroom, Richard and Alan reached a quieter seating area beside tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass. Richard sighed. "I never expected to see you here. My wife received an invitation." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose life has interesting ways of arranging meetings." Alan smiled. "It certainly does." Richard studied him for several seconds. "You haven't changed." "I've gotten older." "We both have." Richard sat in one of the leather chairs and motioned for Alan to do the same. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, like two people who understood one another without needing constant conversation. Finally, Richard said, "I've replayed that day hundreds of times." Alan looked toward the city lights. "So have I. It could have destroyed everything." "It almost did." Richard leaned forward. "My board wanted someone arrested immediately." Alan nodded. "I remember. They wanted headlines." "They wanted someone to blame." Alan's expression remained calm. "They wanted certainty before they had evidence." Richard smiled faintly. "And you were the only person who refused." Across the ballroom, guests continued watching from a distance. Nobody could hear the conversation. But everyone could see Richard Whitmore speaking to Alan with unmistakable respect. Piper stood perfectly still. Her friends had stopped making jokes. Even Courtney remained silent. Several executives quietly approached Olivia. "Do you know that gentleman?" Olivia shook her head. "No." "But apparently Richard Whitmore does." Meanwhile, Richard continued speaking. "I still remember your exact words." Alan laughed quietly. "I doubt that." "Oh, I do." Richard pointed toward him. "You walked into that conference room carrying 3 binders." Alan smiled. "I always carried too much paperwork." "You carried the truth." Richard's eyes reflected memories from years before. The federal investigators had already interviewed dozens of people. The board had reached its conclusion. The media was waiting outside. Investors were preparing lawsuits. Half the executives believed the company wouldn't survive another week. Alan listened quietly. Richard continued. "Then you asked everyone one simple question." Alan already knew which one. Richard repeated it anyway. "What evidence are we ignoring because it doesn't support our first conclusion?" The billionaire smiled. That question changed everything. Alan shrugged modestly. "It was only a question." "No." Richard's voice became firm. "It was leadership." Nearby, one of Richard's assistants approached carefully. "Sir." Richard looked up. "What is it?" "The foundation chair is asking if the presentation should begin." Richard considered the question. Then he smiled. "Not yet." The assistant nodded. "Yes, sir." As she walked away, Richard looked back toward Alan. "I've waited 8 years. 5 more minutes won't hurt anyone." Alan chuckled. "You always did enjoy making board members nervous." Richard laughed heartily. "Only the ones who deserved it." Back across the ballroom, whispers had spread through nearly every table. Guests searched their phones. Some quietly asked one another whether they had ever heard the name Alan Barnes. Most hadn't. That made the mystery even greater. Piper's thoughts raced. She replayed every joke she had made, every dismissive comment, every time she had introduced Alan as just a compliance manager. For the first time since they had married, doubt crept into her certainty. What else had she never asked? What had Alan chosen never to say? And why would one of America's most respected billionaires postpone his own foundation presentation simply to spend a few extra minutes talking with the man she had called a poor nobody? Only moments earlier, Richard leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "I suppose," he said with a quiet smile, "it's time someone besides the two of us remembered what really happened." Alan gave a modest shrug. "I've never been interested in being remembered." "I know." Richard's expression softened. "That's exactly why I never forgot." For a moment, both men watched the ballroom from the private seating area. The orchestra had resumed playing, but the atmosphere remained different. Conversations were quieter. Curious glances drifted toward them every few seconds. Richard noticed. "They're wondering who you are." Alan smiled faintly. "They'll forget tomorrow." "I won't." Richard shook his head. 8 years ago, Whitmore Global Holdings was days away from collapse. Alan looked toward the skyline beyond the tall windows. "It wasn't that simple." "No," Richard replied. "It was worse." He paused before continuing. A routine internal audit uncovered millions of dollars in unexplained inventory losses. Anonymous reports accused senior executives of fraud. Federal agencies opened preliminary investigations. Investors believed our financial statements were false. The board wanted immediate answers. Alan remembered every detail. He could still picture the conference room. Stacks of documents covering an enormous oak table. Lawyers speaking over one another. Consultants recommending public apologies before anyone even understood what had happened. Most people believed they had already found the guilty parties. Alan had been brought in as an independent compliance specialist working with an outside consulting firm. Nobody knew his name. Nobody expected him to disagree with the conclusions already being celebrated. Richard continued. "The evidence looked overwhelming." "It did," Alan admitted. "Emails?" Alan nodded. "Manufactured. Financial transfers. Taken out of context. Warehouse records. Altered?" Richard smiled. "You found every inconsistency." Alan corrected him immediately. "No." Richard looked puzzled. "I followed every inconsistency. There was a difference. Alan had always believed investigators failed when they searched for proof of what they already believed. Instead, he searched for whatever refused to fit." Richard laughed softly. "I remember one director becoming furious." Alan smiled. "He said I was wasting everyone's time." Richard pointed toward him. "And what did you tell him?" Alan thought for a moment. "I said that time spent finding the truth is never wasted." Richard nodded slowly. "Exactly." The billionaire's smile faded into seriousness. The board wanted arrests within 48 hours. They wanted a public announcement. They wanted headlines proving they were taking decisive action. Alan quietly replied, "They wanted speed instead of certainty." Richard sighed. "And you refused." "I asked for 3 more days." "You demanded 3 more days." Alan smiled. "I requested them." Richard laughed. "Trust me, to my board it sounded like a demand." Back across the ballroom, Piper could barely hear the orchestra anymore. Her thoughts kept returning to one question. Who was this man sitting beside Richard Whitmore? Not the billionaire. Her husband. Olivia stepped closer. "Piper." She spoke gently now. "How long have you been married?" "Almost 11 years. And he never mentioned any of this." Piper slowly shook her head. "No." Courtney frowned. "Did you ever ask?" The question struck harder than Courtney intended. Piper searched her memory. She had asked Alan about promotions, raises, vacation schedules, work travel. She had never once asked what he had accomplished before joining Midwest Freight Solutions. She realized something uncomfortable. She had assumed ordinary people lived ordinary histories. Meanwhile, Richard continued. "On the 3rd day, you requested access to shipping manifests nobody else cared about." Alan nodded. They were overlooked. They seemed unrelated. They weren't. Alan remembered discovering a pattern. The inventory losses had never originated inside Whitmore Global Holdings. They originated long before shipments ever reached company facilities. A third-party logistics contractor had manipulated documentation across multiple states, creating the appearance that Whitmore executives were responsible. Finding that pattern required reviewing tens of thousands of transportation records. Most investigators considered the work too tedious. Alan considered it necessary. Richard smiled. "I'll never forget walking into your temporary office." Alan laughed quietly. "The one filled with cardboard boxes. You had paperwork stacked higher than your desk." "I was still organizing," Richard grinned. "No. You already had the answer." Alan remained silent. Richard continued. "You looked at me and asked one question." Alan already knew it. "Do you want the convenient explanation or the correct one?" Richard chuckled. "I've quoted that sentence in board meetings for years." Alan looked genuinely surprised. "You have?" "More times than you would believe." Richard's expression grew thoughtful. "The correct explanation wasn't popular." "It rarely is." "The board hated it. So did the lawyers. They said proving it would take weeks." Alan nodded. "It did. But you proved it." Alan gently corrected him again. "We proved it." Richard smiled. "There you go. Always sharing the credit." At that moment, a woman in a navy evening suit approached their table. She appeared to be in her early 50s, carrying herself with quiet authority. Richard stood immediately. "Rebecca?" She smiled warmly. "I thought I'd find you here." She turned toward Alan. For a second, she stared. Then recognition spread across her face. "Oh my goodness," she laughed in disbelief. "It really is Alan." Alan stood politely. "Good evening, Rebecca." Without hesitation, she hugged him. "It has been forever." "It has." Rebecca Lawson had served as Whitmore Global Holdings' general counsel during the crisis 8 years earlier. She looked at Alan with unmistakable admiration. "You disappeared." "I accepted another position." "You vanished." Alan smiled. "I preferred a quieter life." Rebecca laughed. "That sounds exactly like you." Richard folded his arms. "See? I told you he never changed." Rebecca glanced toward the ballroom where dozens of guests continued watching. "They're all wondering who he is." Richard smiled. "They're about to find out." Alan immediately shook his head. "Richard, no, I mean it." Richard's voice remained calm but firm. "You've hidden long enough." Alan lowered his voice. "This gala is about your foundation." "It is. And my foundation exists because my company survived." Silence followed. Rebecca nodded in agreement. "He isn't exaggerating." She looked directly at Alan. "If you hadn't uncovered the fraud network—" She stopped herself before continuing. "There wouldn't have been a Whitmore Foundation." Alan looked uncomfortable. "I don't think that's entirely true." Rebecca smiled knowingly. "You still underestimate yourself." Back near the ballroom entrance, Piper noticed guests quietly approaching event staff. Some pointed toward Alan, others toward Richard. Questions spread through the room like ripples across still water. Even the musicians seemed aware that something unusual was unfolding. Olivia leaned close again. "Piper, I think Richard Whitmore is treating your husband like an old friend." Piper swallowed. "It looks that way." "No," Courtney corrected softly. "Not an old friend." She watched Richard listening attentively as Alan spoke. "Someone he deeply respects." The difference mattered. Piper finally understood that respect cannot be performed. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be borrowed from expensive clothing or prestigious job titles. It reveals itself naturally, the way Richard listened whenever Alan spoke, the way Rebecca smiled the moment she recognized him, the way both of them treated him as an equal despite possessing enormous wealth and influence. Piper had spent years chasing rooms filled with powerful people. Alan had quietly earned the respect of those same people years earlier, without ever telling anyone. Across the room, Richard looked at his watch before standing. "It's time." Alan raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Richard smiled. "For me to finally keep a promise. I promised myself that if I ever saw you again, I would thank you publicly." Alan immediately frowned. "Richard." The billionaire gently placed one hand on Alan's shoulder. "You spent your career protecting other people's reputations. You never asked anyone to protect yours." He smiled warmly. "Tonight, allow me to do that." Before Alan could object again, Richard turned toward the stage where the Master of Ceremonies was preparing to begin the evening's keynote presentation. He took a slow breath. Then he walked toward the microphone, leaving the entire ballroom waiting for the first words he was about to say. The orchestra fell silent. A single spotlight illuminated the center of the ballroom. The Master of Ceremonies adjusted the microphone and smiled toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight in support of the Whitmore Foundation." Polite applause echoed through the hall. "We are honored to welcome our founder and chairman, Mr. Richard Whitmore." The applause grew louder as Richard walked onto the stage. He thanked the audience with a small wave before placing both hands on the podium. Normally, everyone knew how these evenings unfolded. Richard would speak about scholarships, medical research, veterans housing, community investment. Then the charity auction would begin. Tonight felt different. Richard looked across the ballroom. His gaze settled on Alan. A faint smile crossed his face. "I prepared a speech this afternoon." The audience listened attentively. "It was about generosity." He paused. "I won't be giving that speech." Soft laughter spread through the room. Instead of opening the folder waiting on the podium, Richard closed it. "There are evenings when a prepared speech becomes less important than telling the truth." The room grew quiet again. 8 years ago, Richard continued, "My company faced the greatest crisis in its history." Many executives in attendance recognized the reference. Whitmore Global Holdings had survived a corporate scandal that business schools still analyzed years later. Few people knew the complete story. Richard continued, "Our board believed we had uncovered a massive fraud operation inside our own executive team. We were preparing to destroy careers. We were preparing to accuse innocent people." A murmur moved through the audience. Richard looked toward Rebecca Lawson. "Our attorneys advised immediate action." Rebecca smiled knowingly. "They were doing their jobs." Richard nodded. "They were." "Our consultants presented reports. Our investigators gathered evidence. Our directors demanded quick decisions." He paused once more. Then one quiet compliance specialist refused to agree with everyone else. Alan lowered his eyes. He already knew where this was going. Across the ballroom, Piper felt every heartbeat become louder. Richard continued, "He had no impressive title. He wasn't a vice president. He wasn't a board member. He wasn't famous. He simply cared more about the truth than being accepted." Several guests turned toward Alan's table. Others followed their gaze. Within seconds, hundreds of eyes rested on him. Alan looked uncomfortable. Richard smiled. He challenged assumptions nobody else questioned. He refused to sign conclusions unsupported by evidence. He insisted that every fact deserved to be tested, even if doing so delayed headlines. Richard's voice became quieter. "That decision saved innocent people from prison." Complete silence. "He exposed a criminal logistics network operating across multiple states. He prevented our company from making the greatest mistake in its history. He protected thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended upon our survival." Richard looked around the ballroom. And because Whitmore Global Holdings survived. He gestured toward the banners hanging around the room. The Whitmore Foundation was born. Applause began. It started with only a few people. Rebecca Lawson stood first. She applauded without hesitation. Then several Whitmore executives rose to their feet. The applause spread row by row. Soon, nearly the entire ballroom was standing. Everyone except Alan. He remained seated, embarrassed, hoping the attention would end quickly. Richard smiled. The man I'm describing never accepted public recognition. He declined every interview. He refused every bonus beyond what his contract required. He asked that no press release mention his name. A businessman near the front whispered, "Who does that?" His wife quietly answered, "Apparently, him." Richard continued, "I spent years trying to locate him. When I finally did," he laughed, "I discovered he had quietly accepted a modest compliance position at another company." Several executives exchanged surprised looks. One whispered, "Why would someone with that reputation do that?" Another answered, "Maybe because reputation wasn't what he wanted." Richard stepped away from the podium. "I'd like everyone to meet the man whose integrity changed my life." He extended one hand toward Alan. "Mr. Alan Barnes." The applause exploded. It was no longer polite. It became heartfelt. Guests rose from every corner of the ballroom. Some whistled, others clapped enthusiastically. Several executives who had never met Alan before instinctively stood straighter as he slowly rose from his chair. Alan looked toward Richard and quietly shook his head. Richard smiled back. "You've hidden long enough." Rebecca approached Alan. "I think that's your invitation." Alan sighed softly. "I was hoping to avoid this." "I know," she laughed. "That's exactly why you deserve it." Piper watched as Alan slowly walked toward the stage. Each step seemed unreal. This quiet man, the husband she had introduced moments earlier as a poor nobody. People were now standing simply because he entered the spotlight. Olivia whispered, "I don't believe this." Neither did Courtney. Neither did Brianna. Most of all, neither did Piper. Alan reached the stage. Richard met him halfway. Instead of directing him toward the podium immediately, Richard quietly spoke into the microphone. "You know something interesting about extraordinary people?" He looked at Alan. "They rarely think they're extraordinary." Soft laughter moved through the audience. Richard continued, "Alan, I have one question." Alan smiled cautiously. "I'll try to answer." "After everything you did," Richard spread his hands, "why did you never tell anyone?" Alan looked around the ballroom. Hundreds of faces waited. Television cameras pointed directly toward him. He took a slow breath, then answered with the same calm voice he had used throughout his career. "Because I was hired to solve a problem. Nothing more, nothing less." The audience remained silent. Alan continued, "If firefighters save a family, they don't expect applause every morning afterward. If a surgeon performs a successful operation, he doesn't introduce himself every day as the man who saved someone's life." He smiled gently. "I simply did my job." The simplicity of the answer somehow made it even more powerful. Richard looked towards the audience. "Do you understand now?" He honestly believes that. Another wave of applause swept through the ballroom. Richard placed one hand on Alan's shoulder. "You once told me something I'll never forget." Alan searched his memory. "I've said many things." "You told me." Richard smiled. "Character is what you do after nobody is watching." Alan nodded. "I remember." Richard faced the audience. "I've watched this man for exactly 32 minutes tonight. I watched him thank a nervous waiter. I watched him ignore insults. I watched him refuse to embarrass people who embarrassed him. I watched him give credit away instead of collecting it. Richard's expression became serious. Ladies and gentlemen, that is character. The applause lasted even longer than before. Alan noticed something unexpected. Several waiters standing near the walls had quietly joined the standing ovation. So had members of the hotel staff. They weren't applauding because of a corporate success story. They were applauding because they recognized how Alan had treated them earlier in the evening. Respect recognizes respect. Richard leaned closer to the microphone one final time. I've spent decades meeting successful people. Very few impressed me. He looked directly at Alan. You still do. For the first time all evening, Alan appeared genuinely emotional. He blinked slowly, not because of the applause, not because of the recognition, but because he realized Richard had remembered something more valuable than business success. He had remembered integrity. Across the ballroom, Piper felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes, not from pride, from regret. She remembered every sarcastic introduction, every joke, every dismissive smile. She had spent years measuring Alan by the size of his paycheck and the age of his truck. She had never measured the size of his character, and standing beneath the brightest spotlight in the ballroom, she realized every powerful person she had tried so desperately to impress had already discovered the value in her husband long before she ever did. The applause continued long after Richard stepped away from the podium. Alan stood quietly beside him, unsure where to look. He had spent his entire professional life avoiding attention. Now hundreds of people were looking directly at him. Richard leaned over and whispered with a grin, "You still hate being in front of crowds." Alan smiled. "That hasn't changed." "I noticed." Richard laughed softly before returning to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I promise not to embarrass Alan any further." The audience chuckled. "Although," Richard added with a mischievous smile, "I can't promise he won't embarrass me." More laughter filled the ballroom. Richard turned toward Alan. "Would you stay on stage with me for a few more minutes?" Alan hesitated. "If I have to." "You do." Richard gestured toward two chairs that had been placed near the front of the stage. "Let's have a conversation." The audience immediately grew attentive again. This was no longer a formal speech. It felt personal. Both men sat down. Richard crossed one leg over the other. "I've always wanted to ask you something publicly." Alan sighed dramatically. "I was afraid you were going to say that." The audience laughed. Richard smiled. "When we first met, I offered you a position at Whitmore Global. You turned me down." Alan nodded. "I did." "You also turned down a substantial retention bonus." "I did." "You refused company stock." "Yes." "You refused an executive title." "Correct." Richard looked toward the audience. "Would anyone here like to know why?" Nearly every hand in the room rose playfully. Even Alan laughed. Richard turned back to him. "So, why?" Alan took a slow breath. "My father taught me some things when I was 12. The ballroom became quiet again. He worked maintenance at a manufacturing plant. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't highly educated. But he was the most honorable man I've ever known." Alan smiled at the memory. "One day I asked him why he never tried to become a supervisor. He looked at me and said," Alan paused, "Never chase a title if it costs you the freedom to tell the truth." Complete silence. Alan continued, "I've carried that advice with me my entire life." Richard nodded slowly. "And if you had accepted my executive offer, I would have become responsible for protecting the company." Richard finished the thought. "Instead of protecting the truth." Alan nodded. "I never wanted my judgment influenced by promotions, bonuses, or stock prices." Several executives exchanged thoughtful looks. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard smiled. "That's exactly why I wanted to hire you. And exactly why you shouldn't." The audience laughed again. Richard shook his head. I lost that argument. You did. And I'm still disappointed. Rebecca Lawson called from the front table. We all are. The audience laughed once more. Richard became serious again. Alan, after the investigation ended, you disappeared. You never called. You never asked for favors. You never asked me for introductions. Alan shrugged. I didn't need any. Richard tilted his head. You could have built an extraordinary career. I did. A puzzled expression appeared on Richard's face. You think so? I know so. Alan looked toward the audience. I found honest work. I came home every evening with a clear conscience. My wife and I bought a modest house. I coached Little League for 3 seasons. I volunteered at the food pantry on Saturdays. I've worked with people I genuinely respect. He smiled softly. I've already had an extraordinary career. Many guests lowered their eyes. His definition of success was far different from the one celebrated inside luxury ballrooms. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps we've all been measuring success incorrectly. The audience answered with quiet applause. Near the center of the ballroom, Piper felt as though every sentence Alan spoke revealed another part of a man she had never bothered to know. She remembered criticizing his refusal to pursue executive positions. She remembered asking why he wasn't more ambitious. Now she realized he had made those choices deliberately, not because he lacked opportunity, because he valued something else. Olivia quietly whispered, "He could have been an executive years ago." Piper answered without looking away from the stage. "Apparently." Courtney folded her arms. "And he chose not to." That realization somehow carried even more weight. Richard looked towards the audience once again. "I have another story." He smiled at Alan. "I hope you'll forgive me." Alan sighed. "I probably won't." Laughter echoed across the ballroom. Richard continued. 3 years after our investigation ended, another corporation contacted me. They wanted to recruit Alan. Alan looked surprised. "I never knew that." "I know." "They asked whether I thought you would accept." Alan smiled knowingly. "And what did you tell them?" Richard grinned. "I said, don't waste your airfare." The audience laughed. They ignored my advice. Richard continued. They offered him nearly 3 times his salary. Several people gasped. They offered a luxury apartment, company car, annual stock grants, private club memberships. Richard looked directly at Alan. "And do you remember what you told them?" Alan rubbed the back of his neck. "More or less. I remember every word." Richard looked around the room. He thanked them sincerely. He wished them success. And then he said, Richard smiled, "If a company needs expensive incentives to convince someone to do the right thing, they've probably hired the wrong person." Silence. Then applause erupted once more. Richard laughed. "I wanted to frame that sentence." Alan shook his head. "I was simply trying to decline politely." "You accidentally gave my leadership team a philosophy." The audience smiled. Some executives immediately typed notes into their phones. Others simply watched Alan with growing admiration. Meanwhile, Piper's thoughts drifted back over the last decade. She remembered countless evenings. Alan returning home at 6. Never bringing confidential work with him, never answering business calls during dinner, never boasting about achievements. She had interpreted those habits as a lack of ambition. Now she wondered whether they had actually reflected extraordinary discipline. Richard noticed Piper standing silently near the back of the ballroom. He recognized the complicated emotions on her face. Without intending to embarrass her, he addressed the room. "You know, I've often wondered why people like Alan rarely receive recognition." He answered his own question. "Because they don't ask for it." The loudest people often appear most successful. The quietest people are often carrying the greatest responsibility. Alan looked uncomfortable again. Richard smiled apologetically. I know. You dislike compliments. I do. Then let me ask one final question. Alan nodded. Go ahead. Richard folded his hands. After everything you've accomplished, after turning down promotions, wealth, publicity, and influence, do you have any regrets? The ballroom became completely silent. Even the hotel staff paused to listen. Alan looked down for several seconds before answering. I have one. Richard looked surprised. You do? Alan nodded slowly. I regret believing that the people closest to me understood why I made those choices. The sentence landed with quiet force. He had not looked at Piper. He had not mentioned her name. Yet everyone understood. Piper felt her chest tighten. For the first time that evening, she realized Alan had not defended himself after her public humiliation. He had not argued. He had not corrected her. He had simply accepted that she no longer understood him. That realization hurt more than any accusation could have. Richard noticed the emotion in Alan's voice. He gently placed a hand on his shoulder. I think, Richard said quietly, there are some people in this room who are only beginning to understand you tonight. Alan looked across the ballroom. His eyes briefly met Piper's. Neither smiled. Neither looked away immediately. For the first time in years, they were not looking at each other as husband and wife, pretending everything was fine. They were looking at each other as two strangers realizing how much had been left unsaid, and Piper suddenly understood that the greatest distance between two people is not measured in miles. It is measured in all the questions one person never thought to ask until it was almost too late. The silence between Alan and Piper lingered for several seconds. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Richard sensed the moment and gently stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, breaking the tension, our foundation still has important work to celebrate tonight. The audience applauded politely. But before we continue, he reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo. I have one last item. Rebecca Lawson smiled knowingly. So you finally decided? Richard nodded. I did. He removed a small navy blue presentation box. It was elegant, but unassuming. The ballroom immediately grew curious again. Richard turned toward Alan. I've carried this with me for almost 3 years. Alan frowned. What is it? A debt. Alan shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Richard smiled. We've had this argument before. And I'm still right. No. Richard laughed. Tonight I'm older, richer, and hosting the event. I finally have the advantage. The audience chuckled. Richard opened the box. Inside rested a simple silver medallion mounted on dark velvet. There were no diamonds, no extravagant decorations, only an engraved inscription. Richard held it toward the audience. Every year our foundation recognizes one individual whose integrity changed lives without seeking recognition. He looked at Alan. We've never presented this award. Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. Richard continued, because it was created for one person. Alan's expression changed. Richard, no. Richard smiled. This time you're going to let me finish. The audience laughed softly. Richard read the inscription aloud. For uncommon integrity shown when honesty carried the greatest personal cost. He carefully removed the medal from the box. I'd like to present the first Whitmore Integrity Medal. He paused. To Alan Barnes. The applause returned once again. This time it sounded different. Not louder, warmer, more personal. Richard placed the medal around Alan's neck. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic music. Just sincere appreciation. Alan looked down at the medal before quietly saying, I don't know what to say. Richard smiled. That's another reason you deserve it. Rebecca stood and applauded once more. Soon everyone joined her. Even guests who had never heard Alan's name an hour earlier now stood with genuine respect. Several younger professionals in attendance quietly recorded the moment on their phones, not because it involved a billionaire, because it celebrated character instead of celebrity. After the applause finally settled, Richard unexpectedly handed the microphone to Alan. I know you dislike speech. Finally settled, Richard unexpectedly handed the microphone to Alan. I know you dislike speeches. Alan looked at him. I really do. I know. But there are over 400 business leaders in this room. Richard smiled. If you could leave them with one lesson, what would it be? Alan stared at the microphone. He seemed almost amused. I think you're overestimating my ability to inspire people. Richard folded his arms. I've learned never to underestimate it. Alan took a slow breath, then spoke. When I started my career, I believed success meant becoming important. He paused. My father corrected me. The audience listened carefully. He told me something I've never forgotten. If your children admire your job more than your character, you've failed. Silence spread throughout the ballroom. Alan continued. I've met executives worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I've met warehouse workers earning hourly wages. I've discovered something interesting. Integrity has never depended on income. Several people nodded quietly. Alan continued. Fine. The person cleaning this ballroom tonight has exactly the same opportunity to be honorable as the person standing on this stage. One of the hotel employees standing near the back lowered his eyes, visibly touched. Alan noticed him. He smiled warmly. Character isn't reserved for people with impressive resumes. It belongs equally to everyone. The ballroom remained completely still. No promotion can create integrity. No paycheck can purchase it. No title can replace it. He glanced toward Richard. And no amount of success can compensate for its absence. Richard smiled with quiet admiration. Alan handed the microphone back. I think that's enough. Richard shook his head. I think that's exactly enough. The audience rose once again. This standing ovation lasted even longer than the previous ones. Alan accepted it politely before returning to his seat. As he stepped off the stage, dozens of guests reached out to shake his hand. Several CEOs introduced themselves. Young attorneys thanked him. Business owners asked for a few moments of conversation later in the evening. Alan greeted each person exactly the same way, patiently, respectfully, without the slightest hint that anything had changed, because for him, nothing had. Across the ballroom, Piper watched strangers line up simply to meet her husband, the same husband she had spent years apologizing for. Her thoughts became increasingly painful. She remembered asking Alan why he still drove his old Silverado. He had smiled and answered, "It still gets me where I need to go." She had rolled her eyes. She remembered asking why he never bought expensive watches. Alan had simply said, "I already know what time it is." She thought he lacked ambition. Now those memories carried entirely different meanings. Olivia quietly touched Piper's arm. I think you should go talk to him. Piper swallowed. I don't know what to say. Start with the truth. Courtney added gently, You owe him that. For once, none of Piper's friends sounded judgmental, only concerned. Meanwhile, Alan finally reached his table. Before he could sit down, another familiar voice interrupted. Alan Barnes. He turned. Standing before him was an elderly gentleman in his early 70s, wearing a dark charcoal suit and a simple blue tie. Alan's face brightened immediately. Mr. Reynolds. The older man smiled warmly. I wondered if you'd recognize me. Alan stepped forward without hesitation. and embraced him. The room watched once again. Richard smiled from across the ballroom. He quietly told Rebecca, "Now there's another man who deserves applause." Rebecca nodded. Thomas Reynolds had once supervised Alan during the earliest years of his career. More importantly, he had become the mentor who shaped Alan's professional philosophy. Thomas stepped back and looked proudly at him. "I've been listening." Alan smiled. "I hope I didn't embarrass you." Thomas laughed. "You've never embarrassed me." He glanced towards the audience. "I've been waiting 20 years for other people to discover what I already knew." Alan shook his head modestly. "You gave me my first opportunity." Thomas corrected him. "No. I gave you your first interview. You earned every opportunity after that." Several nearby executives quietly recognized the name Thomas Reynolds. One whispered, "That's the former federal compliance director." Another nodded. "He trained half the ethics officers in the Midwest." Thomas looked at Alan with unmistakable pride. "I still remember the first question I asked you during your interview." Alan smiled. "So do I." Thomas laughed. "I asked what kind of career you wanted." "You answered," Alan finished the sentence himself, "one that lets me sleep well." Thomas nodded. "And I hired you before the interview was over." The executives standing nearby exchanged astonished looks. Piper heard every word. She suddenly realized something else she had never known. Alan had not become honorable because of success. He had built his entire life around that principle long before she ever met him. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and removed a worn leather business card holder. He carefully pulled out an old yellowed business card. The edges had faded with time. He handed it to Alan. "I've carried this for 22 years. Alan looked confused. It was his very first business card, his first professional position, his first title. On the back, written in Thomas's handwriting, were 6 words: "Never trade character for opportunity." Alan stared at the card in silence. Thomas smiled gently. "I think it's time I gave it back." Alan slowly looked up. His eyes had become noticeably emotional. Before he could say a single word, Thomas quietly added, "I never imagined that one day I'd be asking you for a favor." Alan looked at Thomas Reynolds with genuine surprise. "You want a favor from me?" Thomas smiled. "I do." Alan laughed softly. "I'm not sure that's possible." "Oh, it is." Thomas glanced around the ballroom before lowering his voice. "It can wait until tomorrow." Alan nodded. "Then why bring it up tonight?" "Because I wanted everyone here to hear something." Thomas looked directly at him. "Even after 22 years, I still trust your judgment more than my own." Alan's expression became almost embarrassed. "You shouldn't." "I should." Thomas spoke without hesitation. "I've worked with thousands of professionals. Hundreds were brilliant. Many were ambitious. A handful became famous." He paused. "I've trusted very few." Silence surrounded the small group. Several executives standing nearby stopped, pretending not to listen. Thomas continued, "You know what makes trust different from intelligence?" Alan smiled faintly. "It's much harder to rebuild." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Exactly." He looked toward the gathering audience. "Businesses recover from financial losses. They recover from bad quarters. They recover from failed products." He slowly shook his head. "They rarely recover from broken trust." Several CEOs nodded quietly. Richard crossed his arms. "I've spent years trying to teach that lesson." Thomas smiled. "You can teach it." He pointed toward Alan. "He lives it." The distinction was impossible to ignore. Alan gently changed the subject. "So, what exactly is this favor?" Thomas's smile faded into seriousness. "A nonprofit hospital network has asked me to recommend someone to conduct an independent ethics review." Alan listened carefully. They've already interviewed consultants. They've interviewed former prosecutors. They've interviewed retired judges. Thomas smiled. I recommended none of them. Alan already suspected the answer. You recommended me? I did. Alan immediately shook his head. Thomas, hear me out. It'll take nearly 4 months. Alan frowned slightly. I'm not looking to leave my job. I know. The review can be done on weekends and scheduled leave. Alan remained silent. Thomas continued. I only recommend people when lives may depend upon their decisions. He leaned forward. This one does. Alan asked quietly. Is there evidence of criminal activity? We don't know. Financial misconduct? We don't know. Patient safety? Thomas's expression grew grave. Possibly. Alan's face changed. He no longer looked uncomfortable. Now he looked focused. Richard immediately recognized the expression. Rebecca did too. It was the same look Alan had worn 8 years earlier, the look that appeared whenever someone's well-being outweighed politics. Thomas noticed it as well. There it is. Alan blinked. What? The reason I asked. You've already stopped thinking about yourself. Alan didn't answer, because Thomas was right. Meanwhile, several guests politely approached Richard. One introduced himself as the chairman of a manufacturing company. Mr. Whitmore? Richard shook his hand. What can I do for you? I'd appreciate an introduction. To Alan? Yes. Richard smiled knowingly. You and about 40 other people. The chairman laughed. I imagine so. What is it you're hoping to discuss? A leadership consulting role. Richard smiled politely. I'll introduce you. But let me save you some time. The executive looked curious. He isn't interested. You sound certain. I've been trying to recruit him for 8 years. The executive laughed. I suppose my chances aren't very good. Richard smiled. They're considerably worse than you think. Nearby, another executive approached Rebecca Lawson. I'd like to offer Mr. Barnes a board position. Rebecca laughed. You'll be the 5th person tonight. The 5th. So far. The executive blinked. Does he know? Rebecca smiled. He probably suspects. And he'll probably decline. Why? Rebecca answered without hesitation. Because Alan chooses work based on purpose. Not prestige. Back at their table, Piper watched the line of influential people growing around her husband. She had never seen anything like it. Not one person asked Alan about money. Not one person asked what kind of car he drove. Not one person cared about his title at Midwest Freight Solutions. Every conversation began the same way. Thank you. Or, it's an honor to meet you. Or, Richard has spoken about you for years. Those simple words shattered years of assumptions. Olivia quietly whispered, I owe him an apology. Courtney nodded. So do I. Brianna sighed. I judged him after knowing him for 5 minutes. Piper barely heard them. Her attention remained fixed on Alan. He smiled exactly the same way he always had. The same calm expression. The same modest posture. Nothing about him had changed. Only her understanding had. She remembered another evening, nearly 2 years earlier. She had attended a corporate awards dinner. Alan had chosen not to come. She accused him afterward of lacking social ambition. He had simply answered, I'd rather spend Friday with you than networking. She had interpreted that as weakness. Now she realized it had been a choice, a deliberate one. She wondered how many other moments she had misunderstood. Across the room, Alan finally excused himself from another conversation. He walked toward a refreshment table. For the first time all evening, he found himself briefly alone, or so he thought. Piper slowly approached. Each step felt heavier than the last. Alan noticed her before she spoke. "Hi." His voice remained calm. "Hi." Neither knew what to say next. The orchestra quietly resumed playing in the background. People continued talking around them, yet the space between them felt strangely isolated. Finally, Piper spoke. "I didn't know." Alan nodded once. "I know?" "No." She shook her head. "I mean, I really didn't know." "I believe you." She looked down. "I've been thinking about everything Richard said." Alan waited patiently. "I've been remembering things." She forced herself to continue. "I used to think you lacked ambition." Alan smiled sadly. "I know." "I thought you settled." "I know." "I thought—" Her voice cracked. "I thought you were afraid of success." Alan remained silent. Piper finally looked into his eyes. "You weren't afraid of success." "No." "You were protecting something more important." Alan answered quietly. "I was trying to protect who I wanted to become." Those words lingered between them. Piper swallowed hard. "When did we stop talking like this?" Alan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the ballroom. "I don't think we stopped talking." He smiled sadly. "I think we stopped listening." The honesty of the statement hurt, because it felt true. Piper felt tears beginning to form. "I've treated you terribly." Alan didn't argue. He didn't agree either. He simply remained quiet. That silence was somehow more painful than criticism. Piper continued. "When I introduced you tonight—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Alan finished it gently. "You called me a poor nobody." Her eyes closed. "I'm so sorry." Alan looked toward the ballroom windows. Outside, Chicago shimmered beneath the night sky. Finally, he spoke. "Do you know what hurt the most?" Piper braced herself. "It wasn't the words." She looked surprised. "No." Alan slowly shook his head. "I've been called worse." "Then what?" He met her eyes. "The certainty." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "You believed it." His voice remained calm. "You weren't trying to hurt me. You genuinely believed that's who I was." Piper covered her mouth. She suddenly understood. An insult spoken in anger can heal. A belief repeated for years becomes something much deeper. Alan continued. "I realized tonight—" He paused. "We've been living inside two different marriages." Piper's heart sank. "What does that mean?" "You married the version of me you imagined." He smiled sadly. "I married the version of you I hoped still existed." Neither spoke for several long seconds. Across the ballroom, Richard noticed the conversation from a distance. Rebecca quietly joined him. "Should we interrupt?" Richard slowly shook his head. "No." "They've postponed this conversation for years." Rebecca watched Alan and Piper standing only a few feet apart. "They may not finish it tonight." Richard looked thoughtful. "I don't think they're talking about tonight anymore." Just then, Alan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He carefully removed a folded white envelope. It had clearly been there long before the gala began. Piper stared at it. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. Then Alan quietly said the words she never expected to hear. "I wasn't planning to tell you like this." Piper stared at the white envelope in Alan's hand. The color drained from her face. "What is that?" Alan looked down at it before answering. "I've carried it with me for 3 weeks." "You've carried it?" He nodded. "I wasn't sure whether I would ever give it to you." Around them, the ballroom continued buzzing with conversation, but neither of them seemed to hear it anymore. Piper swallowed. "Alan?" His voice remained calm. It isn't meant to hurt you. Then what is it? It was meant to be honest. She looked at the envelope again. Her hands trembled. Finally, she whispered the question she feared most. Is it divorce papers? Alan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her with quiet sadness. I met with an attorney. The words struck harder than she expected. You... What? What? I met with an attorney. When? 3 weeks ago. Piper struggled to breathe normally. She had imagined arguments. She had imagined separation threats. She had never imagined that Alan had quietly taken practical steps without saying a word. Her voice became almost inaudible. Why? Alan's answer came without anger. Because I believed our marriage had become something neither of us recognized anymore. Piper shook her head. No. I thought we still had time. Alan smiled sadly. So did I. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Piper looked at the envelope once more. You were going to give these to me tonight? Alan slowly nodded. After the gala. She stared at him in disbelief. Even before everything that happened? Yes. So, Richard's speech. It changed nothing about why I brought them. That answer somehow hurt even more. It meant Alan had not decided after being publicly humiliated. He had decided beforehand. His decision had been made in private, long before anyone applauded him, long before Richard embraced him, long before the room discovered who he really was. Piper whispered, I thought tonight embarrassed you. Alan answered gently. It did. But it didn't change my decision. She felt tears gathering again. Then, what did... Alan looked directly into her eyes. It confirmed something I had already been trying not to believe. Piper's voice broke. What? That somewhere along the way... He paused. You stopped seeing me. Those 6 words shattered whatever composure she still possessed. She remembered dozens of moments, complaining about his clothes, rolling her eyes when he repaired things instead of replacing them, comparing him to wealthier husbands, joking that he belonged in a hardware store instead of a charity gala. At the time, every remark had seemed small. Together, they had become a life. Alan continued quietly. I wasn't lonely because we disagreed. I was lonely because I stopped feeling known. Piper covered her face with one hand. I never wanted you to feel that way. I know. You do? Alan nodded. I don't think you were trying to be cruel. I think you slowly began measuring me by things I never measured myself by. His words contained no bitterness, only exhaustion. Across the ballroom, Richard noticed Alan still holding the envelope. His expression changed slightly. Rebecca followed his gaze. What's wrong? Richard answered quietly. I think I know what that envelope is. Rebecca looked toward Alan. Oh. She suddenly understood. Neither of them interrupted. Some conversations belonged only to the people living them. Back near the windows, Piper finally found enough courage to ask, Did you love me when you met with that attorney? Alan answered without hesitation. Yes. Her eyes filled with confusion. Then why? Because love isn't always enough, he continued softly. If 2 people stop protecting each other's dignity, love eventually becomes exhausted. Piper had no response. Alan slowly held out the envelope. You don't have to open it tonight. She looked at it without touching it. What exactly is inside? My attorney's contact information. A proposed separation agreement. And, he hesitated, a letter. A letter. I couldn't say everything face to face. Piper felt her chest tighten. You wrote me a letter. Alan nodded. I rewrote it 6 times. Why? Because I wanted it to be truthful. But not unkind. The image overwhelmed her. Alan sitting alone, late at night, trying to find words gentle enough to end a marriage. She whispered, When did you write it? The night after our anniversary dinner. She immediately remembered that evening. She had spent most of dinner talking about Olivia's husband's promotion. On the drive home, she complained that Alan lacked drive. When they arrived home, she had gone straight upstairs. She never asked why Alan remained sitting alone in the living room for another hour. Now she knew. That had been the night he wrote goodbye. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry." Alan remained quiet. Piper continued. "I've apologized 3 times tonight. I know. It's not enough." "No." She nodded painfully. "It isn't." For the first time since they married, she understood that remorse could not erase accumulated neglect. At that moment, footsteps approached. It was Daniel Mercer, Alan's attorney. He had attended the gala as a guest of another legal firm and had planned to speak with Alan briefly before leaving. Daniel stopped several feet away after noticing Piper. "I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt." Alan nodded politely. "It's all right." Daniel looked at the envelope. "I see you haven't decided." Piper looked from one man to the other. "You knew he was here." Alan nodded. "Yes." Daniel spoke respectfully. "I was simply waiting until the evening ended." Piper realized this had all been carefully planned, not dramatically, quietly, thoughtfully, just like Alan. Daniel addressed Piper kindly. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." She barely managed to nod. Daniel turned back to Alan. "No pressure? If you'd rather wait until next week, that's completely fine." Alan thanked him. "I appreciate that." Daniel smiled. "I'll be across the room." He walked away without another word. Piper watched him disappear into the crowd. Everything suddenly felt real. This wasn't an emotional threat. This wasn't a dramatic speech. There was an attorney, there was paperwork, there was a letter. There had been weeks of silent preparation. She looked back at Alan. "Why didn't you tell me?" He answered honestly. "I tried." "When?" "The last 6 months." She frowned. "I don't understand." "You remember when I asked if we could spend one weekend without our phones?" She nodded slowly. "You said you already had plans." He continued. "You remember when I suggested counseling?" Her eyes widened. She had forgotten. She remembered dismissing the idea. "We're not one of those couples," she had said. Alan continued. "You remember when I asked if we could take a road trip together?" Another memory returned. She had canceled because an influencer-hosted networking retreat sounded more exciting. Alan sighed quietly. "I wasn't asking for vacations. I was asking for us." Every forgotten moment returned to Piper at once. None of them had seemed important individually. Together they formed a pattern she could no longer deny. She looked at the envelope one final time. Then, with trembling hands, she pushed it gently back toward Alan. "I can't accept this." Alan looked surprised. "Not because I refused to read it." She struggled to keep her voice steady. "But because if I take it tonight, I'll be accepting the version of our marriage that I created." Alan remained silent. Piper took one slow step closer. For the first time in years, she looked directly into his eyes. "I finally see the man I married." Alan's expression softened. But before either of them could say another word, Richard Whitmore suddenly appeared beside them. His expression was calm, but unusually serious. "Alan?" Alan turned. Richard spoke in a low voice. "I'm sorry to interrupt." "I wouldn't unless it mattered." Alan immediately recognized the tone. "What happened?" Richard looked toward Thomas Reynolds across the ballroom, then back at Alan. "The hospital board just called. They've asked for an emergency meeting." He paused. "And they specifically requested that you be there tonight." Alan looked at Richard for only a moment. His expression immediately became serious. What happened? Richard glanced toward Thomas Reynolds before answering. The hospital board just finished reviewing information that came in less than 20 minutes ago. Alan frowned. I thought they only wanted a recommendation. They did. Richard lowered his voice. They don't anymore. Piper remained standing beside Alan, still shaken by the envelope in his hand. She quietly stepped back, realizing this conversation was no longer about them alone. Richard continued. They've suspended tonight's board meeting. They're requesting an independent advisor before making any decisions. Alan asked the obvious question. Why me? Thomas walked over and answered himself. Because I already told them there was only one person I would trust. Alan sighed. Thomas? I'm too old to flatter people. A faint smile appeared on Alan's face, despite the tension. Thomas continued. They've already spoken with prosecutors. They've spoken with auditors. They've spoken with outside counsel. They're afraid everyone is approaching the problem from the wrong direction. Alan folded his arms. What exactly is the problem? Thomas looked around carefully. I can only tell you what they've shared. They've discovered irregularities involving procurement contracts, medical equipment, billing approvals, and patient transfers. Alan immediately stopped smiling. Patient transfers. Thomas nodded. That's the part that concerns me. Richard added quietly. They don't yet know whether it's administrative negligence or something much worse. Alan remained silent. His mind was already organizing possibilities. Rebecca Lawson joined the small group. I've reviewed the preliminary summary. Alan looked at her. Your opinion, Rebecca answered carefully. The financial issues are significant. But that's not what worries me. What does... If patient records have been manipulated... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Alan understood. Lives, not profits. His expression changed completely. Piper watched the transformation. Only minutes earlier, Alan had been speaking about their marriage. Now every personal emotion disappeared behind quiet concentration. Not because he didn't care, because someone else might need help more urgently. She suddenly understood why people trusted him. He never asked, how does this affect me? He always asked, who might be harmed? Thomas noticed the same thing. You've already decided to help. Alan looked surprised. I haven't answered yet. Thomas smiled. You don't have to. Richard chuckled softly. He's right. Alan finally exhaled. I'll listen. Thomas nodded. That's all they're asking tonight. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, news of the conversation had quietly begun spreading. Several executives recognized the expressions on Richard's and Rebecca's faces. One whispered, something serious just happened. Another nodded. I've never seen Richard leave a celebration that quickly. Daniel Mercer watched from across the room. He noticed Alan still holding the unopened envelope. He quietly decided not to interrupt again. Some decisions deserved more time. Back near the windows, Piper finally spoke. Will you be leaving? Alan looked toward her. I probably will. She nodded. I understand. He hesitated. Do you... She gave a sad smile. I think I'm beginning to. Alan looked at the envelope still resting in his hand. Then he looked back at Piper. I'm not asking you to wait. I know. I'm not asking you to promise anything. I know. I'm simply going where I think I'm needed. Piper felt tears return. That's what you've always done. Alan didn't respond, because it was true. Richard checked his watch. The board members are assembling in the executive conference suite upstairs. They're waiting. Alan nodded once. I'll come. Thomas smiled with quiet relief. I knew you would. As the four of them prepared to leave, Richard turned back toward the ballroom. He addressed the guests briefly. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. I've been called away unexpectedly. Our team will continue the evening. Thank you again for supporting the foundation. Polite applause followed. Most people assumed it was simply another executive matter. Only a handful knew otherwise. As Richard, Rebecca, Thomas, and Alan began walking toward the private elevators, Piper instinctively took one step after them. Then she stopped. She no longer knew whether she had the right. Alan noticed. He quietly stepped away from the group for a moment. He returned to her. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Alan held out the white envelope once more. Piper looked down at it, then looked back at him. I told you, I can't take it. Alan slowly nodded. I know. Without another word, he carefully opened the envelope himself. Piper watched in confusion. Alan removed 3 items: the separation agreement, Daniel Mercer's business card, and the handwritten letter. He looked at the papers for several seconds. Then, without any dramatic gesture, he folded the legal documents back together. He handed only the handwritten letter to Piper. She stared at it. What are you doing? Alan answered quietly. The legal papers can wait. She looked at him in disbelief. And the letter? I think you should read it. You still want me to? Yes. She carefully accepted the folded pages. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Alan looked at her one last time. Everything I couldn't say is in there. She nodded silently. He turned to leave, then stopped. Without facing her, he said one final sentence. I didn't write it because I stopped loving you. He paused. I wrote it because I was afraid I'd forgotten how to hope. Piper closed her eyes. She could no longer hold back the tears. Alan walked away with Richard, Rebecca, and Thomas. She remained standing alone beside the ballroom windows. The orchestra continued playing. People laughed. Champagne glasses clinked together. Yet none of it seemed real anymore. Her entire world had narrowed to a few handwritten pages resting in her hands. She slowly unfolded the first sheet. At the top, written in Alan's familiar handwriting, were 7 simple words. If you're reading this, I finally gave up. Piper felt her knees weaken. She lowered herself into the nearest chair. Around her, the celebration continued. But for Piper Barnes, the most important conversation of her life had just begun on a single sheet of paper, written by the quiet man she had mistaken for ordinary. Piper stared at the first sentence for nearly a full minute. If you're reading this, I finally gave up. Her vision blurred. She blinked away the tears and continued. Alan's handwriting was neat, careful, almost painfully deliberate. Piper, if you're reading this, I finally found the courage to stop pretending that we're both happy. I don't think you're a bad person. I think we've slowly become strangers who keep calling each other husband and wife, because neither of us wanted to admit we were getting lost. Piper pressed one hand against her lips. She continued reading. You once asked me why I never fought with you. The truth is, I was afraid that if I defended myself every time you underestimated me, eventually I'd stop recognizing the man I wanted to remain. I chose silence more often than I should have. That part is my responsibility. A tear landed on the page. She carefully wiped it away before it could smear the ink. Across the ballroom, Alan disappeared into the private elevator with Richard, Rebecca, and Thomas. The doors closed quietly. Piper never looked up. She couldn't. She kept reading. You probably think this letter is about tonight? It isn't. Tonight simply reminded me of something I had already accepted. People don't suddenly stop feeling valued. It happens one conversation at a time, one joke, one comparison, one disappointment, until eventually they stop expecting to be understood. Piper lowered the paper. Every sentence felt like a memory. She remembered comparing Alan to Olivia's husband, to Brianna's fiancé, to wealthy entrepreneurs she followed online. Never once had Alan argued. He had simply smiled. Now she understood why. He had stopped believing she wanted to hear his side. Olivia quietly approached. "Piper?" No response. "Piper?" She finally looked up. "I can't talk." Olivia noticed the tears, then noticed the letter. She quietly nodded. "I'll leave you alone." For the first time in years, Olivia had nothing to say. Meanwhile, on the executive floor above the ballroom, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The private conference suite overlooked the Chicago skyline. Inside, 12 members of the hospital network's governing board sat around a long walnut table. No one was eating, no one was drinking. Several thick binders lay unopened. A projector displayed only one sentence: Emergency Ethics Review. As Alan entered with Richard, Thomas, and Rebecca, every board member stood. The chairwoman extended her hand. "Mr. Barnes?" Alan shook it politely. "I'm Alan." She smiled faintly. "That's what Richard said you'd say." Several people managed tired smiles. The tension remained unmistakable. The chairwoman introduced herself. "My name is Dr. Eleanor Brooks. Thank you for coming on such short notice." Alan nodded. "I understand there are concerns." "There are." She gestured toward an empty seat. "We'd appreciate your perspective before we move forward." Alan remained standing. "I'll be happy to help. But first," everyone looked at him, "I need one promise." Dr. Brooks looked surprised. "What kind of promise?" Alan answered without hesitation. "If anyone in this room has already decided what happened, I'm the wrong person." Silence. He continued. "I don't investigate to confirm assumptions. I investigate to challenge them." Several board members exchanged uncertain looks. One director finally spoke. "We already have evidence." Alan nodded. "I'm sure you do." "But evidence doesn't speak. People interpret it." Rebecca smiled almost imperceptibly. Richard folded his arms. Thomas looked quietly proud. Alan continued. "If you've invited me here, I'll ask uncomfortable questions. I'll disagree with people. I may prove your suspicions wrong. I may prove them right. But I won't protect reputations. I'll protect facts." No one spoke for several long moments. Finally, Dr. Brooks smiled. "That's exactly why you're here." She slid a thin folder across the table. "This is everything we currently know." Alan sat down. He didn't open the folder immediately. Instead, he asked his first question. "Has anyone already been accused?" The board members looked at one another. Finally, a man near the end of the table answered. "Unofficially." Alan nodded slowly. "That's unfortunate." "Why?" "Because accusations change memories." The room became silent again. Alan finally opened the folder. He turned the first page. Patient transfer logs, equipment invoices, internal emails, audit summaries. He read quietly for several minutes. Nobody interrupted him. Then he stopped. He turned back 3 pages, then forward again. He frowned. Rebecca immediately noticed. "What is it?" Alan didn't answer. Instead, he picked up another report. He compared 2 signatures, then looked at the dates. Finally, he asked, "Who assembled this timeline?" A board member raised his hand. "Our internal compliance office." Alan looked back down, then asked another question. "Who decided these documents belong together?" The same man answered. "We did." Alan slowly closed the folder. Richard recognized the expression immediately. He had seen it 8 years earlier. Thomas recognized it too. Alan had found something. Dr. Brooks leaned forward. "Do you see a problem?" Alan answered quietly. "Possibly." "What kind?" I think everyone here may be asking the wrong question. Several people looked confused. One director frowned. What should we be asking? Alan looked around the table. If these documents are accurate, he tapped the folder gently, then someone wants you to believe this is a financial investigation. The room became completely still. Alan continued. I don't think it is. Dr. Brooks's expression changed. What do you think it is? Alan turned one page around so everyone could see a seemingly insignificant patient transfer authorization. This document doesn't belong with the others. The board members leaned closer. It looks ordinary. Alan nodded. Exactly. Then why is it here? He pointed toward a handwritten approval code in the corner. Because whoever assembled this file wanted you to overlook the only document that actually matters. Rebecca leaned forward. I missed that. So did I, Thomas admitted. Richard quietly smiled. There it was again. The same quiet observation. The same instinct to notice what everyone else ignored. Alan looked at Dr. Brooks. Before I answer another question, I need to see the original records. She nodded immediately. We can arrange that. And one more thing. What is it? Alan closed the folder completely. I'd like to speak with the employee everyone believes is responsible. A board member answered, He's already been suspended. Alan looked directly at him. Has anyone actually listened to him? Silence. No one answered. Alan already knew. They hadn't. Back downstairs, Piper reached the final page of Alan's letter. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The last paragraph read, If one day you truly see me again, don't come looking because other people finally respected me. Come looking because you remember who we were before either of us confused success with significance. She stared at those final words for a long time. Then, almost without thinking, she folded the letter carefully against her heart. At that exact moment, her phone vibrated. The screen displayed a single message from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. Don't let Alan sign anything until he knows the truth. Piper stared at the message on her phone. Don't let Alan sign anything until he knows the truth. Her heartbeat quickened. She read it again. The number was unfamiliar. There was no name, no explanation, no signature. Only those 11 words. She immediately typed a reply. Who is this? The typing indicator never appeared. Instead, another message arrived almost instantly. Ask Alan about the trust. Piper frowned. The trust. Her mind raced. She whispered the word aloud. Trust. Nothing about it sounded familiar. She searched her memory. Alan had never mentioned a trust. Neither had Richard. Neither had Thomas. She quickly typed another reply. What trust? This time there was no response. The sender disappeared. Her calls went directly to voicemail. She looked around the ballroom, instinctively searching the faces of strangers. Was someone watching her? No one seemed interested. Guests continued laughing. Servers carried trays of desserts. The orchestra played softly. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that someone in the room knew something she didn't. Olivia approached cautiously. You look frightened. Piper showed her the phone. Olivia read the message twice. What does it mean? I don't know. Who's it from? I have no idea. Courtney joined them. What happened? Olivia handed her the phone. Courtney's expression changed. That's oddly specific. Brianna looked over as well. Ask Alan about the trust. She frowned. Do either of you know what that means? All three shook their heads. Piper folded Alan's letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. I have to find him. He went upstairs. I know. She started toward the elevators. A hotel security employee politely stepped into her path. I'm sorry, ma'am. The executive floor is temporarily restricted. I need to speak with my husband. I understand. I'm afraid I can't allow access. Piper looked toward the private elevators. The doors remained closed. For the first time that evening, she felt completely helpless. Meanwhile, upstairs, Alan continued reviewing documents. The conference room had become even quieter. Additional files had arrived. Original patient charts, electronic access logs, procurement authorizations. Alan requested them one by one. He barely spoke. Instead, he read, made notes, compared dates, asked short questions. Finally, he looked up. I'd like to see organizational charts. Dr. Brooks blinked. Organizational charts. Yes. For the last 5 years. One board member looked confused. What do reporting structures have to do with patient transfers? Alan answered calmly. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Richard smiled faintly. Rebecca recognized that answer. It meant Alan had noticed a pattern but wasn't ready to explain it. Thomas leaned back quietly. He had seen this process before. Alan never rushed. He built conclusions brick by brick. 20 minutes later, the requested charts arrived. Alan spread them across the conference table. He didn't begin with executives. He began with department coordinators, then administrative assistants, then temporary supervisors. Rebecca watched curiously. I thought we'd be looking at senior leadership. Alan shook his head. If someone wanted to hide something, he tapped the chart. They'd hide authority, not titles. Dr. Brooks frowned thoughtfully. What do you mean? Alan pointed toward one name. This coordinator approved supply requests. Then another. This manager approved transfers. Then another. This administrator approved scheduling. He looked around the table. Different departments. Different supervisors. But the same approval chain. Several people leaned forward. Alan circled 3 names. They all eventually reported through one office. The room became noticeably quieter. Richard asked, "Whose office?" Alan slowly turned the final page. His finger stopped on a single box. He didn't speak immediately. Thomas looked over his shoulder. His expression darkened. Oh. Rebecca looked next. So that's why. Dr. Brooks stood. What? Alan finally answered. The Office of Strategic Operations. The chairwoman frowned. That's impossible. Why? Because that office doesn't approve patient transfers. Alan nodded. Officially. Silence. He slid another document beside the chart. But someone quietly gave them authority 2 years ago. No one spoke. Dr. Brooks stared at the paperwork. I never authorized this. Alan answered gently. I'm beginning to think several people didn't. One board member rubbed his forehead. So, what are we actually looking at? Alan chose his words carefully. I don't know yet. But I no longer think this investigation began with accounting. It began with authority. The sentence settled heavily across the room. Richard quietly looked toward Rebecca. She whispered, he found the hidden decision-maker. Richard nodded. He always does. Across town, Piper sat alone in the back seat of a rideshare. She had left the gala, not because she wanted to, because she couldn't simply wait. The mysterious text continued, echoing in her mind. Ask Alan about the trust. Then another memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought about in years. Shortly after they married, Alan had received a thick, certified envelope in the mail. She had joked, "Secret millionaire inheritance." Alan had smiled. I wish. She remembered him placing the envelope into a locked file cabinet in his home office. She had never asked about it again. At the time, it seemed unimportant. Now, nothing felt unimportant anymore. She looked at the driver. Can you take me home instead? Of course. As the city lights passed outside the window, Piper kept replaying every sentence of Alan's letter. People don't suddenly stop feeling valued. It happens one conversation at a time. She quietly cried the entire drive home. 30 minutes later, she unlocked the front door. The house felt strangely silent. She walked directly toward Alan's home office. She had rarely entered it. There had never been secrets between them, only respect for privacy. Tonight was different. She stood in the doorway for nearly a minute, then whispered, "I'm sorry." Whether she was apologizing to Alan or to herself, she wasn't sure. She opened the old wooden file cabinet. Inside, everything was perfectly organized. Insurance records, mortgage documents, tax returns, volunteer certificates. Old baseball photos from the youth teams Alan coached. Nothing surprising, until she reached the bottom drawer. There sat a dark blue document box, locked. She remembered it instantly. The same box from years ago. She searched the desk. No key. She'd searched the bookshelf. Nothing. Then she noticed a small yellow sticky note attached beneath the desk drawer. In Alan's handwriting were 5 simple words. If needed, look behind Lincoln. Lincoln. She looked around the office. There was only one item that fit. A framed photograph of the Lincoln Memorial taken during one of their early vacations. She carefully lifted the frame. Behind it, taped to the wall, was a tiny silver key. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the blue box. Inside were only 3 items: an old sealed envelope, a leather-bound journal, and a thick legal document stamped in bold letters: the Barnes Family Irrevocable Trust. Piper stared at the title. Her breathing became shallow. She slowly opened the first page. The very first line made her freeze. Primary trustee, Alan Michael Barnes. Successor beneficiary, Piper Elizabeth Barnes. She whispered to herself, "What is this?" Then she turned to the signature page. The signature wasn't Alan's. It belonged to someone she recognized instantly. Richard Whitmore. Piper stared at Richard Whitmore's signature. Her hands began to shake. She turned back to the first page. The title remained unchanged. The Barnes Family Irrevocable Trust. She read more carefully. The legal language was dense, but several names appeared repeatedly. Alan Barnes, Richard Whitmore, Thomas Reynolds, and another she had never heard before, Margaret Ellis. The date caught her attention. 8 years earlier. The same year Alan had helped Whitmore Global survive its crisis. She whispered to herself, "This has existed for 8 years." She flipped another page. Attached behind the legal document was a short memorandum. It wasn't addressed to Alan. It was addressed to Richard, subject Barnes Family Trust structure. The first paragraph explained that the trust had been established to protect certain future assets from conflicts of interest should Alan ever accept work connected to Whitmore Global or its charitable foundation. Piper frowned. Future assets, she kept reading. Then her eyes widened. The trust was never intended as a reward. It was designed as a firewall, to ensure Alan could never be accused of making professional decisions in exchange for future financial benefit. Piper slowly lowered the papers. Everything Richard had said suddenly made more sense. He hadn't tried to buy Alan, he had tried to protect him. She opened the leather journal lying beside the trust documents. The first page contained only one sentence. Integrity should never create suspicion. The handwriting wasn't Alan's. It belonged to Thomas Reynolds. She turned another page. Most entries were brief. Dates, meetings, observations, professional reflections. Then one passage caught her attention. March 18th. Alan again refused every form of compensation. Richard worries that one day people will accuse Alan of helping Whitmore because he expected something in return. Recommended solution: establish independent trust before any future relationship exists. Alan must never control its creation. Piper closed the journal. Her breathing became uneven. Alan hadn't known she searched further. Near the back of the document box, she found a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Richard's handwriting, were 6 words: "Open only if absolutely necessary." She hesitated, then carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single typed letter. "Dear Alan, if you are reading this, something has probably happened that forces me to explain a decision I hoped would never require explanation. You refused every dollar I ever offered. So I found another way to protect your future without compromising your principles. You never accepted payment. You never agreed to favors. You never asked for influence. That is exactly why this trust exists. It belongs to your family, not because you earned my gratitude, but because your integrity deserved protection from my gratitude." Piper stopped reading. Tears rolled freely down her face. For years, she had assumed Alan lacked financial ambition. The truth was almost impossible to comprehend. He had spent years refusing opportunities most people would have accepted immediately. Not once. Repeatedly. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was Richard. She answered immediately. "Mr. Whitmore." His voice sounded calm but surprised. "Piper, I'm sorry for calling. I found something." There was silence. "What did you find?" "The trust." Richard didn't answer for several seconds. Finally, he sighed. "You opened the blue document box?" "Yes." "I wasn't supposed to." "No." "You weren't." Piper swallowed. "Did Alan know?" Richard answered without hesitation. "No." She froze. "He didn't know." "Then why was it in our house?" "Because he agreed to safeguard documents he refused to discuss." Piper struggled to understand. "He never read them." "To my knowledge," Richard answered quietly. He never opened the box." She sat down slowly. "Why?" "Because he told me they weren't his." Richard's voice carried unmistakable admiration. He said if something truly belonged to him, he wouldn't need someone else to convince him. Piper closed her eyes. Even now, even after everything, Alan had remained exactly who Richard described. Upstairs, Alan continued examining hospital records. He finally requested access to archived email servers. The board members looked surprised. "We've already reviewed the emails." Alan nodded. "I'd like to review what isn't there." Several people exchanged confused looks. Dr. Brooks asked, "What do you mean?" Alan leaned back. "If these decisions were coordinated, there should be communication. There isn't. So either—" He raised one finger. "Nobody communicated." He raised another. "Or someone removed the communication." Rebecca smiled slightly. "I was wondering when you'd ask." Richard looked amused. "I was wondering why it took you 30 minutes. Alan smiled. "I wanted to make sure there wasn't a simpler explanation." Thomas quietly laughed. "You've always disappointed conspiracy theorists." Alan looked at him. "Facts usually do." An IT administrator entered, carrying an encrypted backup drive. "We recovered archived server snapshots." Alan thanked him. He connected the drive. Minutes passed. Then another. He carefully reviewed deleted message logs. Suddenly, he stopped scrolling. Rebecca immediately noticed. "You found something." Alan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he enlarged one line. Not an email, a deletion record, timestamp, user credentials, authorization chain. He read it twice, then quietly asked, "Who has administrative authority above strategic operations?" Dr. Brooks answered, "Only the executive office." Alan looked at her. "How many people?" 3. He nodded slowly, then looked toward Richard. I think the missing emails aren't the story. Richard folded his arms. What is... Alan tapped the deletion record. I think someone wanted everyone searching for deleted messages. Rebecca's eyebrows lifted. So the deletion itself is the distraction. Alan nodded. The real evidence was never electronic. Thomas smiled. I knew that look. What look? The one you get when everyone else is staring at the smoke, and you're looking for the match. The conference room became silent once again. Alan closed the laptop. I need access to physical records. What kind? Visitor logs. Paper authorizations. Courier receipts. One board member looked puzzled. Why would paper matter? Alan answered quietly. Because people remember to erase computers. They often forget filing cabinets. Downstairs, Piper remained on the phone. She finally asked the question that had haunted her since opening the documents. Richard? Yes. If Alan never accepted anything, why was I listed as beneficiary? Richard became very quiet. When he finally answered, his voice was softer than before. Because Alan made one request. He made a request. Only one. What was it? Richard answered slowly. He said, if you ever insist on doing something for me, promise it protects Piper instead. Piper could no longer stop crying. She remembered every complaint, every insult, every comparison. While all along, Alan had been thinking about protecting her future, not his own. Richard continued, I've met powerful men. I've met brilliant men. I've met generous men. He paused. I've only met one man who consistently thought of someone else's security before his own. Piper whispered through tears. I don't deserve him. Richard answered gently. That isn't the question anymore. She closed her eyes. Then what is... Richard looked through their conference room glass toward Alan, who was already surrounded by stacks of hospital records. The question is whether you'll help him carry the weight he's been carrying alone. Before Piper could answer, Richard's expression suddenly changed. He looked toward Alan. Alan had just opened an old paper courier log, his eyes locked onto one handwritten signature. He immediately stood. Richard had known Alan for nearly a decade. He had only seen that expression twice before. Without looking away from the document, Alan quietly said, I know who they wanted us to blame. He paused. And I know who they were actually protecting. Every conversation in the conference room stopped. Alan remained standing with one hand resting on the old courier log. No one interrupted him. Richard had learned years earlier that when Alan became this quiet, it usually meant he had reached the point where assumptions ended and facts began. Dr. Brooks spoke first. Who were they protecting? Alan looked at the handwritten signature once more. I can't answer that yet. Several board members exchanged frustrated glances. One director leaned forward. You just said you knew. Alan nodded calmly. I know who everyone was supposed to suspect. He tapped the patient transfer file. The suspended employee. The procurement office. The accounting department. He slowly shook his head. They're all too visible. Rebecca folded her hands. And the real decision-maker. Alan lifted the courier receipt. The person who never needed to sign these documents. Thomas smiled faintly. The invisible authority. Alan nodded. Exactly. He walked toward the whiteboard. Without writing any names, he drew 3 circles. In the first, he wrote authority. In the second, access. In the third, opportunity. He turned toward the board members. The person responsible has all 3. He pointed toward the accounting department listed in the reports. They had access, but no authority. He pointed toward strategic operations. They had authority, but limited opportunity. Finally, he placed his finger where the circles overlapped. The person we're looking for controlled all three. Silence filled the room. Dr. Brooks quietly asked, "Do you have a name?" Alan answered honestly, "I have the direction. And that's enough for tonight." One impatient board member objected. "We should suspend more executives immediately." Alan looked directly at him. "No." The firmness in his voice surprised everyone. "If you move tonight, the real person disappears tomorrow." Richard smiled slightly. There was the same disciplined thinking that had saved Whitmore Global years before. Act too quickly. Lose the truth. Thomas leaned back. "I recommend we follow Alan's advice." No one disagreed. Meanwhile, Piper sat alone in Alan's office. The trust documents remained spread across the desk. She looked again at Richard's letter, then at Thomas's journal, then finally at Alan's own handwriting, inside the notebook tucked beneath the legal papers. It wasn't a diary. It was a collection of thoughts, short reflections, lessons, questions he asked himself after difficult days. She carefully opened to a random page. Success is easiest to measure. Character is hardest to protect. She turned another page. "If people misunderstand my intentions, I can survive that. If I misunderstand my own intentions, I can't." Another page. "Never become the person you're trying to defeat." Her tears returned. She had spent years believing Alan lacked ambition. Now she realized he possessed something far rarer: self-discipline. She continued reading. Near the back of the journal, one entry carried no date, only a title: "For the day I forget why I stayed." Piper slowly read. "I stayed because marriage isn't measured during easy seasons. I stayed because promises deserve patience. I stayed because I hoped one day we'd start listening again. If that day never comes, I still want to leave with kindness. Not because kindness fixes everything, because bitterness destroys whatever remains." Piper closed the journal against her chest. She whispered into the empty room, "You never stopped fighting." The realization broke something inside her. She had mistaken quiet endurance for surrender. They had never been the same thing. Her phone rang again. This time it was Alan. She answered immediately. "Alan?" His voice sounded tired but gentle. "Are you home?" "Yes." A brief silence. "I figured." She hesitated. "I found the documents." "I know." She froze. "You knew I would—" "I left the key where you'd find it." Piper couldn't speak. Alan continued. "I wasn't hiding anything. I was waiting until you were ready to ask." Tears rolled down her cheeks again. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because they weren't mine to explain. The trust, Richard created it. I couldn't discuss it without his permission." She took a slow breath. "You really never accepted any of it?" "No, not even once. No." She looked at the signature page again. "I don't understand how someone says no to all of that." Alan answered quietly. "It was never mine." His answer sounded so simple, so completely consistent with everything she had learned that night. She finally whispered, "I've underestimated you for years." Alan remained silent, then said softly, "I know." There was no accusation, only acceptance. That somehow hurt more. Piper closed her eyes. "I don't know how to fix this," Alan answered after a long pause. "I don't either." Another silence. Neither hurried to fill it. Finally, Piper asked, "Are you still planning to leave?" Alan looked through the conference room window before answering. "I honestly don't know." It was the first uncertain answer she had heard from him all night. She clung to it. "It's not a no." "No. It's not." Before she could continue, Richard appeared beside Alan. "They're ready." Alan nodded. "I have to go." "Alan?" "Yes?" She held the phone tighter. "I finally see you." Alan closed his eyes for just a second. When he answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Then the call ended. Not because he wanted to, because duty called once again. Alan returned to the conference table. Dr. Brooks placed another sealed folder before him. "This arrived from our records archive 5 minutes ago. No one here has opened it." Alan looked at the seal. It was nearly 10 years old. The label read, "Confidential. Deferred pending trustee authorization." Rebecca frowned. "Trustee authorization?" Thomas slowly stood. "I know what that means." Richard looked toward him. "You do?" Thomas nodded. "I signed this storage request." Everyone turned toward him. "I completely forgot about it." Alan carefully broke the seal. Inside lay a single handwritten statement. No financial records, no legal contracts, no patient files. Only one page. Alan read it silently. His expression changed in a way Richard had never seen before. Not surprise, not anger, sadness, profound sadness. Rebecca quietly asked, "What is it?" Alan looked up. His voice was calm. "The suspended employee didn't protect himself." He paused. "He protected someone else's family." The room fell completely silent. Alan lowered the page. "I think we've all been investigating the wrong hero." No one spoke. Outside the conference room, dawn's first light began to appear over the Chicago skyline. For the first time that night, Alan realized this investigation wasn't simply about exposing guilt. It was about restoring the dignity of someone who had willingly sacrificed his own reputation to keep a promise. And somehow, that realization reminded him of his own marriage. Every life eventually asks us the same question. What is your character worth? When no one is watching, money can open doors, titles can earn applause, and success can impress strangers, but only integrity earns lasting respect. Alan's journey reminds us that true strength is often quiet. It is found in choosing honesty over convenience, kindness over bitterness, and principles over personal gain. Sometimes the people closest to us fail to recognize our value until life reveals what was hidden all along. But the greatest lesson is not about being appreciated by others. It is about never allowing the opinions of others to change who you are. In the end, reputations may rise and fall, fortunes may come and go, but character is the one inheritance that cannot be taken away. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder to value the people who stand beside you before it's too late to speak words of encouragement instead of judgment, and to measure success not by what someone owns, but by the person they choose to become. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What was the biggest life lesson you took away from Alan's journey? Share your answer in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about integrity, resilience, and unexpected justice, don't forget to like this